Welcome, everybody. This is actually the hardest of all the workshops, but I think it's the most fun. And the reason I say it's the hardest is because there are many things in here that are actually soft and intangible, i.e. trying to figure out what culture means and defining things like vision is not an easy subject. It's not an exact science. So to bring it to life, we're very lucky tonight to have Acquia with us. And if the team from Acquia wouldn't mind standing up, they're all in the front row. I'd just like to introduce Tom, and you could just briefly introduce your team here. They're going to be our case study for tonight.
Really excited to be here. It's the second year we've done this, and hopefully we can share some of our lessons so that you don't make the same mistakes we made along the way, many of them in my career. So on my left, I have Matt Bachman. Matt is in our channels organization. We work with digital agencies, digital marketing organizations. As a company, what we do is we help organizations build, not build, but maintain and sustain websites. People like Economist Magazine, Harvard.edu, Stanford, we cover both sides. Romney for president, and the guy who sits in that colored thing down in Washington too. So we do a lot of different kinds of web things, and we work with a lot of digital marketing agencies. That's what Mac does. Nicole Pare is a relatively new hire in the organization and is our office manager. Hannah Corey is our newest hire. She does our social media, so does all our Twitter and LinkedIn and that kind of stuff. And the head of HR over here, Jamie Sunilia, is just joined us, and she also was at another very hot Boston company called LogMeIn, and so she can share that. And down at the end, favorite, Evan. Evan was with us last year as well, and Evan Duffy handles our marketing programs. So there we go.
I'm going to leave this with you. You can leave it on so we don't have to wrestle with it. Great. So in my mind, the value of these workshops is actually bringing the real world to life. And so having Acquia here is really the value. So I encourage you to both bring questions up for them, and either in the session we'll engage them and get them to share their experience, or afterwards, of course, we can do that informally as well. So what is our agenda tonight? First of all, as I said, there's a lot to founding a company, and we talked about that in the very first workshop. But for tonight, I'm going to pick off the three things that I think are very core and very much at the foundational level of building a business. And they are vision, culture, and people. And in people, it's a whole subject unto itself. We decided we'd pick off hiring in particular because it's one of the greatest challenges for startups. In fact, it's very rare that I go to any startup gathering of any kind where one of the biggest issues that people raise is hiring and how do I find great people and recruit them and retain them and so forth. So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight and hopefully give you a sense of what it actually takes to do it. So first of all, why is this subject important? And let's just make sure we're all on the same page on this. It's certainly something you could skip over. I mean, after all, if you raised a lot of money and started hiring people, you probably could get a product out the door, and you may even get such a great product that it starts attracting people and you start building a business. But I would always say that if you build a foundation for a house that is worthy of, obviously, what you want to put on top of it, then you're in a great spot. The opposite is not true. If you go out and build a great house, many floors, and you haven't built the foundation thinking about how big that building is going to be, at some point it's going to run into all the issues. And it's exactly the same in a business. That foundation, in many instances, is things like how do you get the culture to select the right people and empower them? And then obviously, how do you bring the right people on to execute on your vision, and with a vision that is big enough to attract the right people and retain them, how do you unify them towards the purpose that you have of your company? And these things are very fundamental, and I'd like to immediately start by giving you some examples. Think about this. If you were Larry or Sergey starting Google, and what you'd said was, hey, we're two engineers, we've got a better way to index things. Do you think hundreds of people would have flocked to join you? I doubt it. But what Google did say, which was much more exciting, is that they wanted to index all the world's information to make it useful for people. Now that started to sound exciting. That's a compelling enough vision that people started to think, okay, this could be a real company. So it's very important, even from the get-go, to put some of these building blocks in place. And that's what I'm going to try to share with you tonight. So to give you a sense of where all this fits, last time you were here, we talked about the value proposition. It's almost invariably the starting point for people to get their company off the ground. And as we talked about, it may start with an idea, but often if you can define it in terms of an unmet need or a real problem that actually has to be solved, you're in a great starting point. But it goes nowhere unless you hire the right kind of people who can get passionate about it for their reasons, not for your reasons, but for theirs, and have conviction around how they can make an impact in solving those problems for those customers that you're going to work with. But those people actually are always challenged with the kind of growth that we're going to discuss tonight, which is hopefully what you experience as a startup. Doubling your company every year is not an easy thing to do. And you go through all sorts of challenges with that. And that's where actually some of the things we're going to talk about tonight can really help, like putting the right kind of culture in place. So we're going to talk about that. Now, execution is a whole subject unto itself, so this is just, as I said, a foundational piece to it. But then what we're going to try to do is give you a sense of why vision here is so important. And I think what you'll sense by the end of this evening, if I've succeeded, is that vision is an integral part of what you need to start with, even though I put it at the end here. And it's the old story, any road will get you there if you don't know where you're going. But if you know where you're going and you can define very clearly what your vision is, it'll help people immediately focus on the right things to do. So all these pieces are things that you've probably heard of before, but there's a reality check I want to put in right away. Startups change, and in fact they need to change. It's one of their greatest advantages is they move very quickly to identify what it is that they're really succeeding at with their customers, what problems they're really solving, and so forth. And so there's a lot of what I would describe as listening and leading that goes on. In fact, really great CEOs in many instances do more listening than they do anything else. But then they figure out where the problems are that they can actually go and take a leadership position in, and they develop from that. And of course, as you do that, you iterate things like your value proposition and obviously how you execute and go to market and so forth. But of course, since I grew up, the world has moved on and we have new words like pivot in here, so I had to put it in the vocabulary. So I've included the word pivot. And I came up with a mnemonic. For those of you who've been in my classes before, you've heard me say this. I'm a terrible learner, so the way I remember everything is with mnemonics. So I'm trying to find a way to pay more than lip service to this, and that'll be an easy way for hopefully you to think about this. But all of these things do iterate and do change, with the exception of one. Can anybody tell me what will not change and should not change in the company formation? Culture. Why do you say that?
And people sign on for a particular culture, and if you change it, then the people who signed on aren't as on board with it.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if you signed up to be a Red Sox fan and everybody who was rooting for the Red Sox suddenly decided that actually they weren't going to play baseball anymore. The Red Sox were going to go off and play a whole bunch of different sports. You'd feel pretty disillusioned as a fan. You came to support the players playing baseball. If they suddenly took up ice hockey, you might not be interested in it. It's as fundamental as that with culture, too. When people set a culture for a company, it becomes foundational at a level that it sets out many things that we're going to talk about today. So the one thing I hope doesn't change in your startup, and I encourage you to really think about from the get-go as a consistent theme in building your company, is the culture. So while everything else may pivot, please don't pivot your culture. I've seen companies who try to do that. It does not work. In fact, it's one of the challenges that happens when, for example, you do acquisitions. We did 17 of them in a space of about 3 or 4 years at Symantec, and they were always challenging, not because of the execution, not because of the product, but because of merging the various different cultures together. I have a special guest with me tonight who is actually the very first sales guy I ever hired when setting up Symantec over in the UK, and that is a gentleman called Steve Abbott. So Steve, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love you to come up and take the microphone for me, and just tell me, what was it like when we acquired Pete Norton? Did we have any challenges with the culture? Was the sales force any different? What were some of the things that may have come out for us?
The culture was a clash. A, because we were in a completely different marketplace. B, because they were dominant in their particular area. We hadn't proved anything in reality, but they were the tech leaders, so we were kind of asking them to follow us, when in actual fact it should have been the other way around. So that's always tricky. Their people were first class. We were still learning. We didn't know which marketplace we were in. They did. So it was really tough to bring them with us when in actual fact they felt that they should have been leading us. So that was a clash. We eventually got over it when we actually merged the vision. But that took some time, and in the meantime it was very difficult day to day to work with them. Even though they were nice people, they worked very hard, they weren't us. So that was always an issue that we had to overcome, and putting a mixture of people in play and pretending to put in work groups to organize systems and policies and so on is great, but that's not where the rubber hits the road. And so it's all about people integration. So we tried to cross-pollinate as often as we could. We picked the best people and asked them to lead. And that's what they did, and that's how we were able to achieve it. And then the results we had from that was phenomenal and allowed us to make more and more acquisitions downstream.
For those of you who don't know the story, Symantec was not a big company back then. It was, I don't think we'd even broken $50 million. But that acquisition of Norton brought with it some of the most important things that actually propelled our company. But all the technology was not the challenge. It's everything that Steve just shared with you. And if we had had exactly the same culture, which would be extremely unlikely, it would have been easy. But as Steve said, what it really came down to was trying to integrate the people and get everybody on the same page. And what we ended up doing was actually defining a new and joint vision, which was instead of talking about things like how you would use Norton Utilities to maintain your PC, we talked about data security. And that became actually the driving force. And we decided, I think, at the time to put a couple of other competitors out of business. And so we really declared a war outside the company, which was a single driving force for everybody to get on instead of worrying about what the things were that were holding them up internally. So this is how important it is to do it, that the following year, and I remember the numbers very well, we blew through 100 million and got public, and we never looked back. And that was because we figured out how to deal with this. So even though your story may not feel like it's that big or dealing with that scale, it's exactly the same set of principles. Thank you, Steve. So if I simplify this, why I'd hope you'll think about this right from the get-go is that while your value proposition is a starting point, your vision should be what you're aiming for and that brings everybody together. Your people in your team are obviously the basis for execution, but the culture is the underlying enabler for all of that. And if it is something that's consistent, that enables everybody to flow in the same direction, you'll be very effective with it. So let's jump in on these things specifically. And let's start with the vision and the mission. So what is an example of a company that you admire? Anybody out there in the tech industry? Is there anybody that you think, oh, I admire this company? Google. Why do you admire them? We've talked about them already this evening, but
they have a number of products that are basically the leaders in their field, if you will, like Google Maps, Google Search,
right,
Android.
And do you associate their vision and mission as something that you can relate to?
Yeah, organize the world's information.
Yeah, so it means something to you. So that's the thing I wanted to bring out, and thank you for picking Google. It makes it very easy. Because you basically just gave me the next slide, and a couple of times I'll bring it up. Google has a mission, a vision and a mission that people can relate to very easily. And if you pick a really good vision, it should be something that your entire stakeholder base can relate to, your own internal team as well as hopefully your customers. So it's not an easy thing to do. But the beauty of the Google example is it's just that. People can relate to organizing information. They can relate to getting value out of it. Now, we don't have the founder of Acquia here, but Tom will serve as a very good substitute. When I met the founder of Acquia, his name is Dries Betet. He was also the founder of the open source project behind it, Drupal. He had a wonderful vision, and it was as simple as this. He wanted to build the operating system for the web. It's like, wow, okay, that's exciting. And his view was that while Linux was the operating system for the back-end data center, which everybody else who was actually building the web on was there wasn't an operating system for all the things that were actually on the web, the content and the information and everything that he wanted to share it. Tom, I wonder if you could share how you took that and turned it into your mission, which I know you've stated in a couple of different ways.
Well, actually, we use the vision every year in our strategic planning process to get everybody aligned in the leadership team to talk about what our goals are. And we actually do change the vision every year. We revisit it and talk about it. Today, it's really about creating killer web experiences across community, commerce, and content. Community being social, commerce obviously being e-commerce. And we use that to align everybody in the leadership team as we set out and say, what are our 3-year goals and our 1-year goals? So we haven't really transformed that original vision very much. We've just articulated it in a way that allows us to execute better, which is really where Michael's going to go with this, is like, how do you take a vision and you build something to execute from? So
thank you. So what's great about what Tom does every year is he's explaining how they do iterate and they do evolve their vision. So what are some of the things that you might think about when you're creating a vision? Well, one thing that you don't have control of is the market. And so obviously, if your vision stayed static and the market was evolving, you'd have a problem. That's one of the reasons you do need to evolve it. And the web, for example, has evolved pretty dramatically since we first started the company. In fact, really social was only just getting going, and it hadn't been adopted in business. So we've done a lot of things to evolve how we actually attract business customers, as opposed to what we used to be involved with right at the beginning, which was more educational customers or just media customers. What comes out of that is then obviously a decision on your part about how will you lead it. Nobody wants to be number 2 in the game. Everybody wants to be number 1. So you've got to find a way to say that you personally believe that this vision can lead you into a position of being number 1. Try to articulate that as part of how you set your vision out. And then I think the key is one word in here, roadmap, which is figuring out what will be the steps that you'll take along the way. So we'll spend a bit more time on that in just a moment. Now, even though we've already had this example of Google, I think it's still a great one to just dwell on when you get to the next piece, which is mission. Mission is really a way of actually getting the vision into a more defined form. So you can say, for example, what you want to achieve with your vision. So in this case, the vision for Google turned into organizing all the world's information to make it universally accessible and useful to people. That's such an inspiring vision. I mean, it's something that you can relate to in so many different ways, as obviously a person on the team trying to make decisions each day about what products you build. That can be a touchstone for you. And it's a good point for me to raise at this time as to why operationally vision and mission can make a difference. Can anybody give me a reason why every day a vision and a mission could make a difference to you, even if you knew nothing else about the company? I'll give you a clue. Do you make decisions every day? I see lots of people nodding. Yeah? How do you make those decisions? Do you make them entirely independent of what the company's doing, or on your own, or?
Based on your values?
Values is a great example. And certainly we'll come into that later on. But do you think the vision or mission might help you make any decisions day to day? Yeah.
The mission clarifies when you have an indecision as to what to do with your spare time. For example, if you're working at Google, a good project would be one that would organize the world's information, make it universally accessible. Stuff like Gmail and I believe Google Earth and some others came out of employees on their own following the mission.
Fantastic. I need you up here. You could have given the slide better than me. That's exactly what it is. It turns out that some of the best inventions on the planet came out of employees doing things that were nowhere near their job spec, were not in the book of objectives that they were supposed to be following. And Google's own examples that you just gave there are ones that I think are shining cases in point. Because the team knew what the vision and mission was, it was easy for them to think, well, how could I make an impact on the world, improving the way they access their email or organizing their information that comes into their inbox. And so even if it wasn't an objective or it wasn't in their job spec, they could use this touchstone of the vision or mission to make a difference. Now, the reason I think it's important in a startup is as follows. Even though you think you'll know exactly what you're going to do when you start your company, you're going to take a lot of twists and turns. And in fact, the more nimble you are, probably the more likely you are to be successful. So there are going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions that will be made below the radar of the job spec you've given somebody or the particular role that they're involved in. And those decisions can be informed, or better still guided, or even better still actually driven by the vision and mission. So it can be incredibly important. And I had an engineer once come up to me and tell me something really fascinating. It was not in my company, it was at Hewlett-Packard. He said to me, when we were sitting down trying to design this product, and I'll tell you the product in a second, we had no idea what the customers were going to do with it. And we were really struggling until you came in the year before and explained to us what you were doing. We were building CAD/CAM systems. I said, so what happened in the difference of the last year? And what he explained to me was that HP had a simple goal for their workstation division, and it was to make it possible to apply the compute power that they were creating to the most difficult problems on the planet. Such an obvious thing, but it's a similar thing to Google. And when he saw our problem, which was doing three-dimensional CAD/CAM, this was back 30 years ago before 3D CAD/CAM had ever been done. That's computer-aided design, for those of you who don't know that acronym. He realized that actually it was a problem that involved a whole, obviously, third dimension of data. And up to that point, we only had 16-bit microprocessors, believe it or not. And HP created the first 32-bit microprocessor in that very division in the Rocky Mountains, as it turns out, in Fort Collins. And he realized that, wow, if you had that extra dimension, you could actually use that extra bit depth in your architecture, and you could process really now in real time. And that's exactly what he enabled us to do, the first real-time CAD/CAM system on a 32-bit microprocessor. It was groundbreaking. But it happened not because it was in his job spec, but because his whole vision and mission, informed by HP, was to find the hardest problems to solve. And he'd seen a customer problem, and he'd gone after it. And it came out in a way that not only changed HP with that first invention there, but also changed our business. So this stuff happens all the time. I've experienced it myself. I see it in my companies every day. And there's a key word that I hope you will enable your employees with here, which is empowerment. It ultimately will empower your team if they know what the vision and mission is, and it'll enable them to go and think for themselves as opposed to have everything predefined for them. Okay, so between vision and mission, and back to where we started last week on value prop, your starting point, can be a long roadmap. Just to be specific about it, it often takes several years for startups to become successful. In fact, the average right now is about 8 years for companies to go from inception to, for example, public offering. And lest you not believe me, we'll have a couple of case studies coming up. Bright Cove is one, from my portfolio, Demandware is another, which are 8-year overnight successes. And so when you start with your value prop of whatever it might be, e-commerce on demand, as Demandware did, you have to be thinking about what is the way in which you're going to build for the next 8 years a company that ends up being an outstanding public company. And that's what your roadmap's really about. It bridges between value prop and vision. It should describe the road ahead and how you imagine your journey. Nobody is going to score you based on it, because we all know you don't have a crystal ball. But what you can do is say, well, there are some tangible steps, for example, that we think we will want to look at as milestones. And examples might be things like, obviously, once you figure out, if you're using the cloud, how to get a product entirely based in the cloud, that might be one milestone. The next thing might be something as fundamental as getting the first 100 customers to adopt it and form, for example, some kind of a network effect if you're doing something in the social media space, and so on. And you can think of these dependent on your business. The more you can think of those milestones, the more helpful it will be to your team to try to understand how to build a vector from where you're starting, which is your initial value prop, towards your vision. Okay, now the fun one, culture. So what the heck is culture? Anybody here got any idea of what a culture is? Is it something we grow in a petri dish? Yes, hand at the back.
One thing I've heard is that it's what you do when no one's looking.
That's a great statement. It's another piece of what we were talking about earlier. If you don't know what your culture is, you could probably go off in many different directions. But if you're informed by a culture, it'll help you and, again, provide some kind of a touchstone for you. Is that what you meant?
Yes.
Good, okay. So anybody else? Well, next question before we get into too much definition. Why is it important, therefore? Go ahead.
Because it's a set of beliefs and attitudes that actually allows, frames people to do things. And these beliefs and attitudes tie people to their work. And that's why it's very important. Because that's their main motivation. That's
fantastic. Again, we've got a great class here tonight. Couldn't have said it any better myself. So I'm not sure everybody heard all of that, but those beliefs that you, as you said, help frame people in terms of how they might attach to their work. So think about this for a second. You grew up, whatever circumstance you did, I'm sure we all had different ways in which we grew up. And that informed all sorts of things for you. Maybe it's, for example, some religion that you subscribe to, or some particular way in which you believed you should contribute to the world, or the way in which you involved in your community. When you come to work, how do you attach to work? I mean, unless somebody tells you, do you know? I mean, if there's no culture, well, what's the belief of this place? So if you think about growing up, there were lots of things that probably your parents provided you didn't even think about, or your community provided, or ultimately your friends provided, that gave you the personality that you are. Well, what we're looking for is that same thing in a work environment. We've touched on one of the reasons, which is because there are hundreds of decisions that are below the radar. But this next one is really critical. We want to try and find something when we start a company that unifies all those different backgrounds. And in every company, when you hire even beyond 4 or 5 people, you'll quickly discover loads of different backgrounds. I mean, just think about that for a second. So how are you going to unify everybody to actually get their energy concentrated to all behave in a way that actually makes them effective together as opposed to dissipated? It's tough. It's actually very tough. Well, obviously one of the ways we talked about is vision and mission. But this culture piece, as the young lady said, is another key piece, because when you don't know what the answer is or what you should be working on or where there's a gap in your understanding, then this is a great touchstone for it. So I'm going to pause here and have a bit of fun. There's a reason why the word culture has cult in it. So how many of you ever belonged to a cult? Anybody? Sorry, it doesn't have to be a religious cult. It doesn't have to be an embarrassing cult, but it helps if it is. Go ahead, Steve.
I'm in a cult, which is my soccer team in London. About 60,000 of us turn up every week, go bananas, and 2 hours later we decide that's not good for us anymore and we go back to our normal life. But that to me is a cult. Everything about it is my energy for the day. My wife would say, if they lose, we all leave the house. That to me is a cultural, energetic environment. It's all about focusing on the same direction at the same time. Arsenal does that for me every week.
So any other Gunners supporters here? Yep, I was too, until Chelsea beat them. No, that's okay. Sorry, was that a question or a Gunners supporter?
I was just giving an answer. Would you consider Unix a cult?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I shouldn't answer. What do you think?
I think so.
Yeah, and tell me why you think of it as that.
Because it has its own philosophy of simplicity and having multiple options for everything, not tied down. For example, if we support multiple file systems and the user can choose which one he wants. And it will have multiple scheduling algorithms. Again, the hacker can choose which one he wants. And then pipelining. So there is certain philosophy to it, like doing one thing at a time and then pipelining the different tools or utilities to get the actual result of doing work.
Now, one thing that's immediately evident to me is how clearly you articulate what that culture is. Just like I heard Steve describe his culture around Arsenal. So the point is, even though they're completely different things, Unix, football supporting around Arsenal, you both are very clear about what it is that represents. That's exactly what culture is all about. It's about defining what you want your company to represent and how you want people to understand what you stand for and behave when, as the young lady said, you don't necessarily have some rule or written down regulation to follow or some guideline. So it's an incredibly important thing. Now, the exciting thing about listening to you both is that it's very obvious that you also hit the key point, which is it unified your thinking around, obviously, how you do things like modularity, simplicity, pipelining, etc. Or in Steve's case, probably how he goes and drinks, but that's a whole nother story. So this unification is extremely important. It's exactly the point I wanted to make here, which is it's about how you concentrate energy versus dissipate it. So if I could leave you with one thing before we move on from this subject, it's the following, which is how can you help enforce the culture in your company? In other words, contribute to it. And if you're finding an effective way to do that, then it's probably an effective culture. If you don't know how to do that in a startup, you probably don't have an effective culture yet. You probably haven't defined it enough. You probably haven't got a real culture yet. But if you're really like cheering and you're one of those hundreds of thousands of fans that is behind a team or something, that's how you should hopefully feel at a company. Go ahead.
A small question about startups who have their operations offshore.
Yep.
Maybe based in India or China or Philippines. And those countries have their own cultures, the way that people think about working and collaboration. So how can you deal with that once you're based out of Cambridge?
Fantastic question. How many countries did we operate in, Steve, by the time Symantec had got to $1 billion? I mean, it's got to have been dozens. Yeah, I mean, so it was a real challenge. But let me bring Tom in, because he's dealing with it for real right now. Tom, we've got multiple countries. We've opened many of them up very recently. How are you getting the culture felt around the world?
Well, actually, I can relate as well to having run the international business for a public company called Web Methods. And when I started that business, we did 4% of the company's revenues. When I finished with Web Methods, we were doing 60%. and that was in 13 different countries. So more diverse than what I have right now. You hope and you pray a lot. No, in practice, it starts with communication. It starts with setting examples. It's a lot easier to do today than it used to be. I started my international career in 1981 when I moved to Australia, and in those days, you almost ended up creating your own culture in each different geography in different places around the world. Today, with the internet and the ability to communicate, we have an all-company meeting at Acquia every month. In fact, we have one again next month, and we get everybody in the company online together, and we talk about things like culture and about values and behavior, and we talk about what it means to be successful and to win, and that's one of the ways, one of the many ways we do it. Another way is that we ship people all over the world. So we incubate, or we birth them, or whatever you want to say, in the Acquia culture here in the headquarters, and then we send them to the overseas posts or to remote operations so that they take that with them and they share that. And then we complement that with a lot of executive visits. So right now this week, our head of engineering is in Europe. Our head of customer solutions is in our office in DC. 2 weeks ago, I was in our office in Portland, Oregon, and we go there and we share and we communicate. So that's different ways we do it. So,
Fantastic. Did that answer your question? Thank you very much, Tom. And this is real stuff. I mean, we don't have what I would call black and white answers, but I think you can hear from Tom, that it's stuff you just have to work through, whether it's by, shipping people around the place or finding ways to communicate and engage. But it makes a huge difference if you find a way to unify the company, no matter where it is around the world, into a single culture. I'm going to go back to HP, Hewlett-Packard, for one moment, because they're a great example. I think Hewlett-Packard was one of the first companies. First of all, they were one of the first companies in the tech industry way back when that sort of kind of got Silicon Valley going, for those of you who've ever followed the history of it. And Hewlett-Packard became a huge company long before it ever got split up into Agilent and HP. And at one particular point in time, we were their largest desktop computer customer in the world. And so they would fly us from Fort Collins, where I was mentioning they invented the workstation, to San Diego, where their plotters were made, to Boise, I think, where their disk drives were made, to Geneva, where I think they did their networking and some of their other things like inkjet printers. And the thing that staggered me was that anywhere you went around the world, there was one culture. And I often ask people, I said, what is the culture of HP? Why is it that HP feels like one company? And it was one simple thing. And it was a culture that was fostered by Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard doing what they called management by wandering around. That was it. And it became a term that was known sort of universally from that. Because up until that point, many companies had been built on a very hierarchical basis, and execs didn't walk around. But they literally caused everybody in that company to get up out of their cubes or out of their offices and walk around and make sure that, to the point Tom was making, there was a sense of people caring and connecting and sharing and building a universal understanding of what it was they were all doing. So that's a simple example, management by wandering around, of something that unified a huge company all around the globe. And as a customer, I felt it every time I went to those different places. So it might sound little, but these early principles that you start in culture make a huge impact in big companies as they grow. But what's interesting about this is you can actually measure it. And that is in the Fortune Tech top 5 companies in their study of what the best places are to work. You'd find Google, SAS Institute, NetApp, Zappos, etc. You would find that, in fact, the comparative stock market returns for these companies is actually 3 times that of their competitors. In other words, the best places to work that create great culture have 3x the performance on the stock market of the people that don't care about it. So this isn't actually just intangible. When it really comes down to it, this makes a difference. And so don't ignore it. Easy as it might be as a startup to just jump straight into figuring out how to build a great product, this stuff will make a difference in the long run, more than what you build as your first product. And trust me, you won't realize it right up front, but it'll also serve you in such good stead in so many other disciplines. Go ahead.
So then, apart from your mission and your vision, how do you codify a culture, particularly as you start to grow?
Fantastic. You're a straight man for my next slides. So people always ask me that. They say, look, this sounds great, but I need some practical examples of what should I do to codify a culture. That's what the next few slides are about. So if I haven't answered your question after the next few slides, please call me up on it. So the first thing I'd recommend you do is you just talk about as a founding team, what are your beliefs? What do you care about? What is the stuff that matters to you? And by the way, that might be personal. In fact, the more personal it is, probably the more real it is. So it might be things like, hey, you really care about customers because you personally have enjoyed great customer service somewhere, or really scorned some horrible experiences you've had somewhere, and you want to be different. You want to stand out for being, phenomenally customer focusing, for example. A second thing you might put up is what we were just about to hear from, I think, Evan earlier on, which is values. So, Evan, if you don't mind, since you brought it up earlier on, what are some examples of values that you think Acquia has?
Sure. So we talk a lot about passion specifically. Every candidate that we interview for a new position at the company, we want to know, what are you passionate about in your job, and what are you passionate about outside of your job? Because we find that when people get really excited about whatever it is they're doing, they'll be more productive, they'll be a team player, and just work towards kind of like what we've been talking about with the mission and the vision and all that good stuff. So that's, I'd say that's
at
one
least
of the
one
things.
value.
Yeah, that's one of the things we talk about a lot.
Great, thank you. Any of the other Acquia team want to bring up a value that you think that is represented at Acquia?
Just overall, everyone kind of has that feeling of integrity, I think.
That's a very...
I don't know if you guys feel that way, but...
That's a critical one.
I'm shy. No. Integrity, passion, there's a lot of other dedication, just motivation. People will go home and work for hours just because they want to, not because they have to, which I kind of think is good.
Thank you. I mean, those are real values that matter. And you can't make that stuff up. I mean, if you have integrity, people know it. If you don't have integrity, guess what? People also sense that. Passion is not something that you can just pretend to have. I mean, the reality is passion comes across, right? We feel it. So we are talking about some basic things here, but I'm going to try to help you sort of double click on that because, again, people always say, yeah, that sounds good, but it would help me kind of get it out. So the best way to get out some of the guiding principles is to ask questions. Ask hard questions of yourselves when you're starting the company. Things like, for example, does the customer come first or your people? That's a hard question. I'd love to hear actually just some answers from the group here. Anybody want to give me their view of that? Should the customer come first or should your team come first? Anybody? Yeah?
Team, they're your internal customers.
Say more. Why should the team come ahead of the external customer?
Well, because without your team, then no one's gonna sell your product anyway. No one's gonna. They're the linking point between your product and your customer.
Fantastic. Hands up who agrees with that. Okay. The rest of you that are asleep, or you got to answer the next question. Okay. So who believes that customers should come first? Yep, a couple here. Go ahead.
I think customers come first because without customers, you don't have a company, you don't have a market, and if people are convinced by your vision to serve customers, then they're happy too. So the team does come probably a very close second, maybe first, but not in that direct way that you serve the team and they'll serve the customer. We serve the customers and they're serve the team.
Fantastic. Who believes in that? Okay. The good news is, I think lots of you are raising your hands again, including me. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer there. Does anybody else agree? I mean, why not both? In fact, in every company I ever started, Steve, you could probably call me if this was BS, we always said both come first. Sorry, you had a question in the back.
I believe that the customer should come first because we actually targeted the customers, not our people who buy our products. So.
I agree with that. And I might also agree with the gentleman saying up front here, well, what if your people aren't happy? Do you think that a customer service person answering the phone saying, yeah, sure, you should probably hit the reset button. Actually, I don't really care. Is going to sell your product versus the guy who gets on the phone and says, wow, I'm really sorry you had that problem. Let me see, how could I help you recreate that and find a way to get around it? Oh, we didn't fix that? Let me get you some credit or whatever it is that I can do to help you move the next one. I mean, which one do you think is going to be more effective selling your customer?
Maybe it depends on the product. I mean, if you produce airplane as a staff, I don't need to buy this or I couldn't afford this, but I can sell it.
Well said. It could depend on your product, it could depend on your industry, it could depend on many, many things. So this is why I want to make this clear. There's one word here at the top of my slide that really matters, and it's principle. It's not a rule. Culture is not about creating rules. It's about creating guiding principles, because they won't even apply in some circumstances. And that's why it's something you want to get people to internalize. So I honestly believe both parties are right. Different things would apply at different times, or maybe even in different circumstances. That's what culture is about. It's got to have that level of, if you like, authenticity to it for each situation. Yes?
I struggle to see how you could have one without the other. It's almost chicken and egg.
Yep.
People aren't happy, your customers, like you said, are just not going to be. But equally, if you do things institutionally that upset your customers, the people aren't going to stay for very long either.
Couldn't agree more. So, you perfectly defined why in every company I ever started, I said people and customers come first, and we are two sides of the same coin. We make each other successful. But that's actually a cultural statement right there. And it says that we should hold ourselves to that. We should not let our people fall behind because we're not taking care of them, nor should we let our customers fall behind. And we should make it a principle of ours. Now, I'm not saying that that's right for everybody, but you sound like you'd be on the same page as me on that. Guess what? I'd probably hire you. Just an important point. It's actually what we look for, is trying to find cultural fit. Go ahead.
But I want to push back because I don't understand how that's helpful to say, well, our customers come first and our people come first. How does that help someone decide when those two things are in tension, which decision is the one? Inevitably,
Great.
Whether your customer or whether your staff and people are your top priority is only important when those two things are at odds.
So I'm going to give you a very concrete example, and I hope I don't embarrass her because she's not here today. But I had a phenomenal customer service representative who was well known to be just above and beyond great with customers. One customer really upset her, and so much so that it was a tough thing because it was a very big customer. And if I had taken the customer's side, according to them, I probably should have let her go or demoted her or whatever. I did not, because I had seen for many years before that how good she was with so many customers. And in my book, in the First Equal book, it needed equal balance. It wasn't just an automatic out the door, hey, our culture says customers come first, we've got to let this woman go. And in fact, I can tell you she went on to win what was known as our President's Award when we got to be quite a big company. So it does help decision making. And you'll find it over and over that these principles really help you go back and evaluate. Well, wait a second, before I just make a snap decision and say that person should be out the door, let's think about this for a second. The customer's not always going to be right. Again, you may have that as a different cultural value. That's just one of the things we subscribe to. I said this is going to be hard today. It is. So I'm trying to share with you things that are principles, not answers. But I hope they get you thinking about what do you want your business to stand for. And any one of these questions here, by the way, I think we could find answers on both sides of it. This is one of the things that goes wrong as companies grow. It's what is the role of management in a company? And everybody has a different view of this, by the way. In some companies, it's very hierarchical and it's very regimented. In other companies, it's a support function. Tom, how do you think about management?
Well, the first and foremost thing is that I think that is defined by you, the entrepreneur, and the type of company you want to have, and it can vary dramatically. I was thinking about it as we were thinking about examples before. One of my previous investors in another startup was a private equity firm out of New York. When I go down there for meetings, you'd walk into the hallways, and each one of the partners had an office, and outside of the office with this beautiful wood paneling on the office, there was an assistant, and down the corridor, that's all you saw were offices with closed doors and assistants sitting outside, and that was setting up this sort of hierarchical management structure, and that worked for that organization. That's the way they worked. We have a very different philosophy, and my management philosophy comes from, it's a little bit old, but it comes from the 80s from a man named Tom as well, Tom Peters, who wrote a book called Thriving on Chaos. Anyway, he was a very famous management consultant, and he drew an organizational chart that was upside down, and he said the most important thing in organization is to support the customer, and the most important people in your organization, therefore, are the people who are directly facing the customer. And the CEO is at the bottom of the chart, and their job is to support the entire organization. And that drove a lot of my thinking throughout my career, actually, about management style and the way we do things. And we have a completely different kind of culture, but it is our culture. And it stems from my own belief as well that I don't like org charts at all. And I actually had a conversation with some folks earlier today that ambiguity, and this I learned from a different consultant, a guy out of McKinsey. Actually, so was Tom Peters from McKinsey. And they created org charts that were intentionally ambiguous. And part of the goal of having ambiguous org charts is people are more motivated when they don't feel like they have a particular sort of limit to where they can, what they can do and how they can do it. It does create a little bit more chaos, obviously, but it's less hierarchical. It's a very different contrast to that private equity firm in New York. So it really is about what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to do, in my opinion. So.
Thank you. And this is a very real example, by the way, of a cultural style that either does or doesn't suit you. Tom's style happened to really suit me, which is why I'm lucky enough to have hired him. It's very important that you do connect with whatever it is that you see as the management style or culture of a company. Because if you don't, and you're somebody who likes command and control and absolute precise org charts, for example, or definitions, you probably wouldn't fit in an organization that Tom or I would try to build. And so it's also important when we come to talk about these things in terms of basics, like how do you hire people, connect them to the values that you're subscribing to in your business. So thank you, Tom, for that. And I'm going to ask a question of all of you before we move on, which is, which do you prefer to be, judged by results or by effort? Hands up who likes to be judged by results. What about effort? Okay. So fewer people put up their hands for effort. That is one of the toughest things I think cultures very quickly figure out, is what do you want to be known for? Delivering or trying hard? Avis decided it was we try harder. I mean, that became their entire statement, right? I would say that there are other people in that business who have definitely got a different culture. I won't say who, because I'm not trying to denigrate anybody, who it's all about results. And believe me, those two car hire companies are completely different places to work. And if you were one or the other, you would never go to the other side. So this stuff is the kind of thing that I encourage you to answer that question that you brought up earlier about how do you form your culture. You want to get this stuff clear early on because it helps you in many, many different regards formulate the way you're going to run your business. Okay, Tom already talked about this, but I had to bring up a Dilbert cartoon because it makes it a lot easier. So I'll leave you a moment to read this. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't realize for 6 months what's really going on in their organization because they don't put energy and effort into communication. This stuff happens. So I will just state another example of something that defines your culture that you probably don't even think about. Do you have cubes and offices, or do you have open plan? Do you think that's cultural? Anybody think that's cultural? Yeah. Can you tell me why?
In an environment where it's an open office environment, you're going to have more communication. You might have less privacy in a sense, so that's value that you have to juggle. But to have people siloed off in individual offices is very different cultural feeling than to have an environment where everyone can see what everyone else is doing in the same time.
Yeah, very much so. So fantastically said. And I want to make sure that people think about this. I'm not saying one or other's good or bad. I've seen startups do incredibly well who've got nothing but offices. For example, that might work great if you're a research lab and you're doing bioengineering because you don't want culture spreading from cube to cube, trust me. And those are real cultures. But by contrast, if you're starting a social networking company, do you think social might actually want to be open? I think so. Yet, again, I'm amazed how many people don't. Sorry, yes?
I was just amazed that there could be a possibility your different departments are laid out differently.
Absolutely.
Like account management, working with clients, cubicles because they're on the phone all the time, software development and UX design, sitting all together on open floor plans.
Absolutely. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask Tom to give me his view here again and maybe talk about one thing I know you do, which is your customer day and how you get communication and how you have your offices laid out and how you think about this.
We have an office that has different size dividers. They aren't really cubes, they're dividers. It's laid out like an architect's office actually, where there's rows and there's just a small divider that separates you. And for the folks who have more phone time, they get 6 inches more. but it's not a cube. It's just 6 inches more to create some deadening of the sound. It seems to work. I can walk across the sales, and I love this part because I can see everybody, and I can say hi to everybody all at the same time, and yell at them too. Well, I don't really yell at them. I say, "Come on, let's go!" But and when the bell rings, when we make a sale, everybody can hear it, and everybody can see it, and everybody can see who's ringing the bell, and that's all cool. And in fact, engineering is much lower, and that works. I believe in it. In fact, I've been working with Nicole to move myself out of an office. We're running out of offices again, and move into cubes. And part of that is because I just like the energy of being with everybody else. That's me. That's the thing. Not everyone in our office likes that. So there are a number of places where people who have direct reports, and this is our rule, the people with most direct reports are allowed to have some offices so they can have one-on-one meetings, because one-on-one meetings are a big, big part of our culture. You are allowed to have a one-on-one meeting with anybody you want at any point in time. That's part of this communication. In fact, just before I came here, one of the reasons I got here at the very last minute was one of our engineers said, "Hey, can I get on your calendar?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Is there anything particular?" He said, "No, I just want to catch up and I want to get some mentoring." And that's one of the things that our culture has, is you have that ability to say, "I want to meet with anybody, anytime, anyhow." Michael alluded to what we have as a customer service day. We do 4 customer service days a year, where 2 of them are purely technical, where everybody is technical in the company drops everything they're doing and just focus on solving customer problems for that day, and we call out to all the customers. 2 of the days of the year are entire company customer service days. And for those 2 days, what we do is we create kind of like a, you've seen, I'm sure, on public television where they have the call centers and the banks of people sitting at tables and just a bunch of people calling on the phone, and they have the television cameras showing all the banks of people. How many of you seen this before? Some of you? Yeah. So we create an environment like that with scoreboards and people bringing things, drinks and pizzas and stuff into the group, and we rotate people in and out of that little area during the day to talk about customers, customer sats, and we have screens that we put up around with tweets and quotes and other things we get from customers to get people excited about customer success, which is, what we're trying to achieve through that. So that's another cultural thing. So
great. So again, these are real-world examples of how people make those decisions. So I hope you get a sense, and it sounds like you're nodding your head. Looks like you're nodding your head even. And I think Tom answered it very well. There's no right answer. Again, it's how you define your culture. So the reason I put communication up here is that culture doesn't spread by accident. It spreads by defined communication. And it needs consistent reinforcement, just like anything in life. And so what I encourage you to do is to define how you communicate as part of your culture. This is not something that should happen by accident. Again, startups that succeed take time to think about how do they communicate, either formally or informally. And obviously there'll be things that you probably do just based on the way you're, for example, building a product. So if you've adopted agile methodology, you'll have stand-up scrums. But what about the people who are not in engineering? How do they find out about what's going on in the world? If you're small, you can have a water cooler. But if you're big, you probably need something like a town hall meeting where you can literally gather people, in some cases all around the world, on video conferences, etc. And if you get really big, you have to send in questions in advance. But it might seem like it's all too much sometimes, but there's no such thing as too much communication. I should have made this a startup secret. You cannot over-communicate in a startup. It is so important to enable everybody to get on the same page, and not just for reinforcement of culture, but for what you really need to do, which is to try to check in with each other about how are your plans actually going? How is the progress on things? What are the results people are getting from it? And if they don't know that, it's really tough. I mean, think about it for a second. Do you like it when you don't know how you're doing? I don't. I mean, everybody needs to know how they're doing. It's a fundamental need. And do you want to know how everybody else is doing? Of course you do. It's a natural thing. So this stuff's really important. Acquia has a process that they call GDP. And Tom, you've sort of talked about it, but could you give us just a one-liner on what GDP is and how you work that?
Yeah, one-liner probably not, but I know you're telling me to be short. It stands for Goal Deployment Plan, and I talked about it earlier when we said how do we get from vision to execution. That is our GDP process. We have monthly follow-ups around that, and at the end of that process, we come up with what are called 7, well, this year we have 7. We come up with a series of strategic agenda items, which we then communicate and often print and put on the walls for the entire company to know. So it's another communication. It's a common term. It's something we do every year, and people just know that's part of GDP. That means it's important. Got to get that done.
Thank you. And I can tell you from seeing Tom do it, it's been something that's made a huge difference as the company has grown so fast, to have had that consistently, because people who are sometimes coming in halfway through the year have no idea why the goal was set, you know, at the beginning of the year, but at least it's visible for them and they can all see everybody's on the same page and quickly get in sync with it. And that's what's happening when you've got people hired constantly. Have we hired, what, 60 people in the last 6 months?
130 this year.
130 this year. Okay, so now you're getting a sense of the scale of this problem. So about 60 every 6 months, 130 in the last year. I mean, that's a pace at which this stuff really matters. What's that?
9 months.
9 months, very good. So growing faster, I love it. So what I encourage you to do is one simple thing here, and that's just create a common language. Because one of the biggest problems I see in startups is that people all think they're communicating, but actually they're really not. They're all saying things in their language, and you've not agreed what that means. And so this common language is incredibly important, especially as you grow, because again, everybody has different backgrounds, different cultures, and trust me, when I say quite as a Brit, it means a completely different thing than when you say quite as an American. Does anybody know that? I have a couple of Brits here, so I'm going to ask them. Hey, John, since you were kind enough to come this evening, what does quite mean in English?
I guess it depends on the context, but if I make a remark to somebody and they say quite, it's a sort of begrudging acceptance of the point.
Thank you. Tom, what does quite mean in American?
Well, I was going to say, having lived in Australia for so long, we'd say someone like John, who I know well, is quite nice. It actually means you aren't nice at all.
Which he is.
Which he is. And of course, quite in America is a nice adjective to say it is better than that other,
exactly.
You know, whatever it's modifying.
So we all are what was once famously said, two nations divided by a common language between England and America. But trust me, in a startup, it's usually multiple people divided by multiple backgrounds and multiple languages. And this stuff becomes really important to define in communication. So let me introduce John, since I've already called on him. John Bruce is a multi-time successful CEO. Good to have you here, John. I was lucky enough to have met John when he came to work with my team at Symantec back, was it 18, 20 years ago? We don't want to date ourselves. Yeah, probably 25 years ago, a long time ago. John, can you tell me a little bit about what was the common language we created at Symantec? Were some of the frameworks that stood out for you that, you know, how did we define vision, mission, or goals? Were there some things that stood out?
You know, it's an age ago. It's an age in 7 companies ago or something. But yeah, you know, I think I listened hard when you were describing earlier the blended cultures, and I'd just like to add something, if I may, which is, you know, company cultures. One needs to be careful about the tension of that, because it's not normalizing to a set of common themes and motives and values. It's really an opportunity to leverage disparate cultures around the world. And as you mentioned Symantec, I reflect on when I was running marketing across Symantec, and I would go from office to office, and you know, I'd meet with the French office and we'd talk about their marketing campaigns, and then off I'd go to Germany and talk about their marketing campaigns, and then Italy and so on. And actually, the most fun I had in the years of doing that was just how different each culture was. And the opportunity that exists for the company is to blend all that into a corporate culture that really does leverage all this disparity. So yeah, Symantec, you know, I think Michael makes a really, really, really insightful point, which is it helps very early on I used that expression earlier, to normalize the expressions of the business. And you know, the not just in the context of planning, but and how one communicates, but also in the context of how one frames the product. I find in a small company I'm running today, there's 16, 17 people in it. And if I talk to the engineers about what we're building, and I talk to the sales department about what we're building, they'll each describe a totally different product if we don't help them with that. And so the constructs of even the product and the features of the product need to be, you know, normalized somewhat. Otherwise, you'll find a sales department talks about one feature and function, and the engineers have no clue what they're talking about. So I know it sounds like a simplistic component of the business, but it starts even at that level and then goes all the way up through your planning processes and
Fantastic. It's a great example. It's a very practical example too, because sales and engineering very often don't have common language, and in fact that's why you have product marketing and product management, is to bring that language together and get people on the same page. But I just want to underline John's point, because I've actually said this from day one since I started doing these workshops a couple of years back, or whenever it is, that I want to learn from doing these workshops. And I just learned something tonight, which I think is really true, which is actually great cultures don't normalize. That's a great observation, John. They really empower and bring out the best of what individuals all around the world in different circumstances have to bring. But hopefully they do provide a common framework for that all to be channeled, so it becomes one set of energies focused on, obviously, whatever the vision and mission is of the company. So thank you. That was great input. Okay, here's a big one, and it's an easy one to start with, no matter how big you are. It's figuring out what do you celebrate and reward. So I'll tell you, I've never seen any company that doesn't celebrate sales. I mean, go figure. Of course they do, right? That's an easy one. How many companies celebrate marketing when you get great press releases and you get great headlines? Most people, right? Do people celebrate engineering in startups? Yeah, I'm seeing heads nod, but less so. Yeah, they generally do. How many people celebrate services? We do. Why do we celebrate services?
They're the face of our customer.
Yeah. Yeah, they are the face to our customers. So if they're not celebrated for taking care of customers, you'll pretty soon get into that issue of you don't have happy people, you won't have happy customers. What about admin? Should we celebrate admin? Nicole's here tonight. She does office management.
Nicole won Employee of the Month last month.
Yes! I think we need to give her a round of applause. Let's face it, if Nicole wasn't running the office at Acquia and you just had 160 people join in the last 9 months, do you think things are going to work? I don't think so. So I think it's fantastic that you celebrated her. But this stuff, by the way, needs thought. It doesn't happen in absence of people defining what it is they want to value in their company. So I encourage you to think
Michael,
about
I'm going to just throw one thing in here. The way that we do this that works is that we actually let the whole company decide what needs to be celebrated. They figure it out for us. It's the easiest thing because I don't have to do the work. So they're the folks who decide what the great achievements were.
You are such a straight man for me. It's perfect. So I was going to recommend exactly the same thing. We created something which you guys will probably remember from the company that we started in Europe called European Software Publishing that actually brought Symantec over there. We started something called Pride, peer recognition for individual dedication and effort. And the notion behind it was that anybody could go to anybody and say, I want to recognize you for something you just did for me. But we also tried to keep track of that so that at the end of the month or at the end of the quarter, whatever it is, those tallies of those peers recognizing each other was bubbled up so literally everybody could celebrate who was actually making an impact. But you know what? It made everybody feel great. And it also established what was a real culture of caring between people. So I'm not saying that'll work for you, but I'm just saying, just as Tom did, it's a lot easier than you trying to figure it out if you're CEO and get to know 300 people and who's doing the best job. You'll never know that. But people at the coalface will. Sorry, that's another English expression. People at the customer service desk or at the admin level will know. So I encourage you to think about this. This is a big part of what makes culture. And then the last piece that I would describe, we were talking a little bit about this earlier, is values. Trying to define what these values are. So this is more of where I think John was making his point. You don't want to normalize people, but you can define some values that you think are important. So we already had one very clearly defined, I think, by Nicole, which was integrity here. So she brought that out. What about respect? Do you think respect's important in a company? What does respect mean? Does it mean that you respect just hierarchy, i.e. somebody above you, or do you respect anybody? I'll tell you what it meant for me. It meant actually a little bit about what we're starting to talk about, which is that you should respect everybody in their own individual way for who they are. Because who are we to judge somebody based on where they come from or what they believe? I personally don't think I have any right to do that. I mean, I might totally disagree with somebody in my company or in one of my teams or whatever, but even if I completely disagree with them, I should respect that they have that viewpoint for a reason. And if you can create a culture that has got that kind of respect, I think you'll get a lot more out of people. That's my belief anyway. So I put at the bottom here something much more important than anything that's on my slides, which is I'm not trying to preach to you that these are the right values. That is not the point of this. I'm just trying to exemplify things. And what's really important in a culture is that it be your culture. and authentically yours. Anybody tell me why that's important? I mean, you could go read a bunch of books, right? Good to Great from Collins would be a great example of something you could go read. And you could write your culture up, but would that work? Go ahead.
I think sometimes if your culture is really great, even if you might not have the best product or the best business model, it will just attract the kind of people who would like to contribute to your mission just as a result of your culture alone. And I feel like if you have the kinds of values that allow people to do what they would like to do on their spare time, you'll find people that will come to you on their spare time and contribute to your mission and feel like they're rewarded for volunteering, so to speak. And that's, I think, the best metric of when your culture works.
That is very well said, and you're going to help with a little piece that comes later on. And so thank you for that. And what I'm also trying to get out here, though, is something a little additional to that, which is why is it important that it be your culture, not something that you read out of a book or you read off my slides and made up and put up on the walls? Go ahead.
I think it would just be too hard and take too much effort to try and pretend to be someone else with someone else's values while trying to build a company at the same time.
Exactly. Perfectly said. This is the bottom line. Culture is not something you write down and put up on a wall. It is what you live. It's what you model. If you write up on the wall that you really respect people, and the next day somebody sees you admonishing somebody, completely disagreeing with them and firing them, how long do you think that's going to last? I mean, it's going to last 5 seconds. The reality is cultures are all about what you actually show every day and deliver with conviction. So make it authentic, because otherwise it won't stick, trust me. And this is a truth that a lot of founders feel uncomfortable with, but you better get used to it. It comes from the top. And that usually means the founder and CEO. So if you don't believe me, go look around the companies that have founders and CEOs of one culture versus another, and tell me whether it reflects on them. It won't take you long to figure out. It comes from the top. And in fact, I would often say that the founding team is responsible for defining the culture, and it's not something you can reverse engineer. So don't think that this is something you can drop into a company 2 years into you having got the company off the ground because you suddenly realize, oh, it's important. It doesn't work that way. By then, you'll have already defined the culture. Why? Because you'll have been living it. You'll have been living it for 2 years. You've been hiring people in that way, et cetera. So that's why I call this such a foundation of the business. So with that, thank you very much for sticking with me through this section. This was the hardest section by far of tonight. I have a question from the back. Yeah.
So you talk a lot about culture and maintaining it throughout
Yes.
sort of the life of the company. And then when you talk about formalizing culture things around like communication and how you reward people,
Yep.
how much of that is trial and error? Like in your experience, do you usually have an idea and it works?
Yep.
Or is it something that you're constantly refining in terms of how to formalize?
So it's a really great question, and the reason Tom's chuckling up the front, making me chuckle, is because it's hard. So do you want to answer that?
No, you asked, I think, how much of it you know right off the bat, and how much do you wing later on or something? And the answer is, you're winging constantly. You know, you're learning constantly. Things change. You know, the culture of a company in today's environment is different when I started my career 30 years ago. People don't expect the same things. New hires don't want the same things, and you have to change. And so, if you're building a great company, you'll change some of those elements during the time. Maybe not the values, but you know, the notion of, for example, that we have beer in our culture, and you know, maybe that's an instrument, but that alcohol is tolerated and it's there available for you all time. That would not be something that 20 years ago people would have thought was okay. And that's a change. So,
I mean, it's such a great question you ask, though. So, I don't want to give you the impression that you've got to nail all this up front. So, here's an example of something that we always used to espouse as a culture, and that is that it's okay to be wrong. And why that's important is because it's too much of a constraint to always expect people to be right. So, how I would apply that in answering your question is, guess what? I would do my best to try to get a culture that was consistent. But I'd be okay with the fact that it might not work if I hired a bunch of Gen X, Gen Y people who had a different approach to, for example, you know, alcohol or partying or, you know, what office hours should be. I mean, there are so many things that evolve as cultures evolve. I mean, I'm going to give you one Uber trend that I've noticed that is really changing in my companies. from when I used to start, and I'm aging myself here, but my first company I started when I was 18, and I had no idea what I was doing, by the way. So that's why I'm trying to give these workshops, so I can hopefully inform you from some of the scar tissue I've got. But one of the things I remember back then was that everything was very much about being accountable in very defined ways to that bottom line. Everybody used to think about, oh, it's all about the bottom line, it's all about the bottom line. What I notice in some of my great companies now is actually they have social giving programs. They've actually found ways to do things that engage their employees in giving back to their communities. And by doing that, not only are they, it's got nothing to do with the bottom line, it's actually totally outside the company, but they're helping those teams form around causes that they really believe in. And so, for example, something that I learned to do was to create a matched program, matched donor program that I did for every one of my companies after about 1990, I think, where any of my team, if they said to me, hey, I believe in this charity, would you mind matching it? I would automatically match it. I think I do it with Tom does Supports Movember, which is coming up soon, so I know he's going to ask me to write a check. But I'll match his donation, and I'll pledge to do it. And I pledge to do it again this year, Tom, because I think it matters. And that's not something I knew 20 or 30 years ago. So it's okay to be evolving these things, and it's actually good, I think, to be open that you're evolving them too. That would be, I hope that answered your question. It was a great question. I'm going to show you a few pictures here from a way in which we took culture and we made it a physical manifestation in one of my companies. So think about this for a second. A lot of what we've talked about is not tangible, but some things are, like, for example, the way you lay out your office. So we were having this exact challenge. We wanted people to really feel like we were different, we were special when we were starting a company in the Valley in the mid-1990s and the bubble was starting to take off. And people were starting to do things like put cars in their lobbies and say, guess what, you hire the next person, you get this car. I mean, it was crazy, just ridiculous stuff. We decided we didn't have the resources to be to that level, but we wanted to be seen as a different culture, somebody that really stood for something, that signed up to our convictions. So we physically got people to sign up for the company. They came through our orientation programs, and if they decided that this was a company they really wanted to be part of, they signed the wall and said, yeah, I want to be a founder and I want to be a piece of this company. And not only did they sign it, but they kept signing it. And so we kept, in fact, running out of wall space until people would have to find spaces on different walls, going around corners. And guess what? Pretty soon we had walls all around the company that were signed up with people who really didn't ever feel like this was somebody else's company. They were physically contributing to it in so many ways. What happened when we moved buildings? What was the first question everybody asked? What's going to happen to the walls? Well, you're damn right we moved them. There was no way anybody was letting us move offices until we figured out how to physically cut those walls out and move them so that the next set of recruits could be in there and actually have that same experience. That was a physical manifestation of our culture, and it was well known that this was a company that really stood for something. We really believed we were physically building something, and it meant something. So I feel like we're very privileged to have Acquia here, and they'll be too modest to tell you this, but they have already garnered many different accolades for being not only one of the fastest growing companies on the planet today, but one of the best places to work, one of the most promising companies, etc. So I'm going to run a video which allows you to see what Acquia has defined as its culture, as a way to give you a sense of a little bit of the physical manifestation of this.
Working at Acquia, it's very fast-paced, it's very entrepreneurial. It's challenging and it's a lot of fun.
Working at Acquia is probably one of the greatest jobs I've ever had in my life.
Acquia's founding changed my life in a pretty big way, helping to build one of the fastest growing startups in Boston.
I came to Acquia because I saw an opportunity that I hadn't seen since I got into this industry.
The opportunity of getting involved with a platform as significant as Drupal, as open as it was, with such a passionate developer community.
Working with the open source project, Drupal, is great. It's really the highlight of the job.
Just felt like the right place, right time, amazing opportunity.
I looked at the vision for Drupal and I said, this is the future, and I want to be part of that.
So we're hiring like crazy, and it's a real challenge.
The challenge of growing is making sure that we continue to communicate, we continue to find new great people.
I think the important thing when you're hiring people, though, is to look not so much for raw experience, what does the resume show, but instead look at who they are as a person?
I think good people like to work with good people.
Instinctive drive to accomplish something in the world, that passion and the smarts to go with it.
I'm being with people that I like to be with who share those common interests, and that makes it a heck of a lot of fun.
We're a company that has a very, very bright and promising future. We're enabling a lot of individuals and companies to do things that they've never really been able to do before. So it's very exciting. It's a once-in-a-lifetime chance. I mean, we're on a company that is just, it's a rocket ship.
It's really a tidal wave that I'm happy to be riding.
So that was directly to your point. They actually went to the trouble of creating a video to make sure that when they were recruiting people, they could define their culture so people could say, is that the kind of place I want to work or not? Now, it might not suit some people. It may be that it's too fast-paced or whatever, but hopefully it gives you a sense of it. Now we're going to actually define this, though, because it's part of our agenda. And it is, in my opinion, the most important thing you're going to do as a startup, which is try to figure out how to hire the right people and develop them. In fact, if I had the time to do it, and we'll do this as a separate workshop if there's enough demand for it, we talk about all of these aspects around people because all of them are important. But the brief overview I'll give you today is you have to specify up front what you're really looking for. Again, a basic thing to say, but very few startups really take the time to write that job spec clearly enough. And I'm not saying you've got to get every facet of the job spec right, but if you can't in a group agree about what you're looking for, then guess what? You're never going to get the right hires. You're just going to get into that clash of, well, I thought you meant this and you thought I meant that. So that's really important. Finding people is one of the toughest things. One of the best things about great culture is that it differentiates you. But the last two pieces that I'll quickly cover are also incredibly important. It turns out the faster you grow this, the more important this becomes, which is really developing, coaching, and mentoring people because their roles will change. And inevitably, as the company changes and grows, they need to develop new skills and so forth. So I can't overemphasize how important that becomes, but that's probably further down the track than your startup. And retraining even more so as you grow and people, for example, find themselves not fitting in a role. But there's also one thing I want to emphasize that I think I don't see enough of, which is how to fire people when things don't work out. Because this is a real part of your life. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read his book, Noam Wasserman has created a wonderful book. And it's really all about what it is that the human capital aspects challenge you with. And one of the things is, in reality, you will hire people early on that fit perfectly for the early stages, but don't necessarily fit as you go on. So I have three pieces of advice for you here to sort of consider. One is, can you actually retrain them? Is there another place you can put them into? If you can, that's the first thing you can do. The second is, if you do have to let them go, make it about the company, not about the individual. Because in reality, you're not invalidating somebody because you're letting them go. Somebody's still great at something. Everybody's good at something, right? They just aren't a fit for your company at that point in time. Their skills don't fit. And so few companies really handle it in that respectful way. And what you've got to remember is when that person leaves the company, are they an ambassador for your company? You bet they are. And what do you want them to say? That you didn't treat them respectfully and that you just fired their ass and that you didn't care that they don't have a job? No. If you could help them figure out what it was they could learn from that, where they might be a fit, what it is they're good at, and maybe even give them placement, you could make a big impact and you could turn that person into a great ambassador of your company. And I'll tell you, as startups that succeed, the ones that make the best ambassadors are when they've let somebody go and they did it respectfully and they handled it well. So be respectful of people and try to find a great way to handle the exits as much as the hiring. It makes a huge difference. So on to the fun part. This is all about what I would describe as listening. Hiring is listening. Easy for me to say. So what do we typically hire for? We typically hire for these two things, EKS and IQ, experience, knowledge, and skills, and the smarts, the intelligence quotient. Perfectly reasonable. But what have we been talking about here? Has it been about people's smarts, or has it been about who they are? We've been talking about culture, right? How do you hire for culture? Anybody know? Anybody got any ideas? Nobody? Go ahead in the back.
You give them a test that stresses what your culture is and see how they adapt to it.
You could definitely do that. I've certainly not tried that, but there's no reason why that wouldn't work. Well, I don't think there is one right answer, but anybody from Acquia care to jump? Tom?
We actually, up until recently, I interviewed every single person who joined the company, and I'm not qualified to interview them other than for this next point that's going to come up, and that was for a cultural match. And the way I would do that was I would just sit down and sometimes just see what they wanted to talk about in the meeting, see what their questions were for me. But obviously it goes back to something that Evan talked about earlier, which is starts with passion, and we really drive that. We have a thing we call our PIII, which stands for passion, intelligence, integrity, and initiative. And we look for those in every single candidate who joins us. And that is, this next item that Michael's going to talk about. So
perfect. So what's great about what Tom's done here is he's defined something that they have PIII that includes this cultural fit. And I would encourage you to actually create your own way of it. Mine is CQ, which is cultural quality of fit. It's basically a way of saying, what is it when you're hiring people you're looking for? So passion was one thing we've heard from Acquia. Integrity is another we've heard from Acquia. We've heard many things actually from that video, but you could actually define those. And then to your point, maybe you create some kind of test around it. It needn't be a written test, it could be an oral test, whatever, but define it. Why? Because guess what? It makes an impact. And this is a direct quote from a guy called Dick Costolo, who's now CEO of Twitter, where he talks about the fit between personalities being more important than just finding the people who are good. And that is my direct experience. I've actually never had this quote in this session until now, because there wasn't a book that before Noam was good enough to write The Founder's Dilemma that gave this in empirical evidence. But you should go out and read this book as a founder. It's a fantastic book. And I'm going to bring Noam in to collaborate in the classes going forward, because he and I definitely see eye to eye on this stuff. So another great Harvard professor who's quantified this. And what you'll find in there is that it really is true. If you hire great people for their skills and their IQ, that's great. But if they don't get along, it doesn't last 2 seconds. I mean, it's obvious when I state it, right? But yet the number of times I'll see an engineer say, oh, I just find the smartest guy on the planet. He's whip smart. He's so good at this. We've got to hire him. Did anybody ask whether he actually is going to get along with anyone? And the answer often is no. Because guess what? He thinks he's right all the time, and he doesn't want to listen to anybody else. And in a collaborative culture, that probably ain't going to work. And I see that all the time. And what does that result in? Turnover. What does that do to a company? Takes you down, takes you backwards, costs you money. It's very, very detrimental to you. So this stuff is really important. Hit a question in the back.
My question is about cultural fit that you recommend as the main method to hire people.
Yep.
I'm thinking about maybe we need people that sometimes change the culture, not just being fitted into it, add more value or even direct it to a different direction, which is our favorite.
Perfect. You're, again, a straight person for the next thing I put. So I agree with that. And as part of what I think John was saying earlier, we're not really looking to say that everybody's got to be the same. We're trying to say two things. And this is the quality control, as I call it. The opposite of CQ is QC. And it's our quality control. Is each hire additive or dilutive? Do they bring something new? Or are they going to take away by being, for example, Eeyore? As I was just on the phone with one of my board members who was telling me that just had a problem with a sales rep who just thought everything was wrong. And you know what? If you think everything's wrong, it probably is going to go wrong. So that person was a problem, was dilutive. But people who are additive bring new stuff. They might bring new experiences, new convictions, new beliefs, so long as, and this is the key thing, they either multiply the culture or in some way are additive to it. I think you're in a great place. What you don't want is people who are divisive in any sense, who divide your loyalties, who divide your values, who don't believe in your convictions, because guess what? They will derail you and they'll cause that dissipation of energy that we're talking about. Does that make sense? Yeah, great. So the next thing I then hear is that everybody wants to hire A+ players. It used to be A players, and then Google came along, and so everybody needs a plus. So now it's A+ players. I've got to hire an A+ player. Well, it's true. It makes a huge difference to hire A players or A+ players. So the common sort of vernacular around this is that A's hire A's, B's hire C's, and C's you don't want to know. And it's unfortunately true. Now, everybody has a different definition of what an A player is, and it's obviously different for different circumstances. But there are some common things I'm going to try to help you with. And what I would define as the top 3 attributes of A players are indeed 3 A's. Attitude, aptitude, and ability, of course. Now, the ability one I'm going to knock off, and it's at the bottom for a reason. That's the easiest one to figure out. That's their experience, knowledge, and skills. You can read that on their resume. You can go reference that anytime you want. You can check it out with tests. Easy. The other 2 that are really important that make A players, in my experience, especially in startups, are aptitude and attitude. So why is an attitude important? Yes?
So for me, attitude is all about how you go about doing the work. And I think there's so much range on any given project of what you can do. But your attitude determines how much of that you actually end up doing, how you behave with the people around you, and your entire approach to the work. And I think especially in the startup environment, there's so much, makes up so much of the work activities that we're doing.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Again, great articulation of it. That is so true. In the startup environment, there are so many things you don't know. So if your attitude is, well, if I don't know, how can I do it? You're in trouble. Think about this for a second. Great startups usually make breakthroughs. Well, the word breakthrough has what in it? Break. You're going to break stuff. You're going to end up in places that are unknowns. So unless you have an attitude that's comfortable with that, that's going to be leaning forward trying to deal with what you've broken through to in this unknown, you're going to struggle. So attitude is hugely important. And I'm not going to say any more because you articulated it so well. The next piece is aptitude. I should explain what that means because sometimes it's not obvious. Aptitude is your ability to learn and to take on new stuff. Again, why is that important in a startup? Because guess what? You're going into the unknown. We just talked about that. So you're going to have to learn by default. It hasn't been done before. That's the definition of what you're doing when you make a breakthrough or you're achieving something different. So you need people who've got aptitude. So those are my first 3 A's, and I strongly recommend you think about the way you might create your own versions of this. I'm not saying they're the only 3 A's. And I then go the one extra step and I say, what are the pluses? And the pluses for me are things that really determine who the person is. So they're not what they do or how they've done it, but who they are. So the first thing is, are they self-aware? Now just think about this for a second. If you're not self-aware, the first problem you have is that you don't know what you don't know. And so how can somebody help you? Well, maybe one thing you could admit is I'm not self-aware, I need help with that. That's a good attitude. I would say that. At one point, I would definitely have recognized that I wasn't self-aware. I was a young punk getting started, but fortunately, I wanted to learn. Otherwise, I'd be in a lot of trouble. But you need to look for that. And we'll talk about why in teaming later on. The second thing is authentic. We've sort of talked about that already. I mean, if you're making this all up, it's not going to work. It's very quickly getting exposed. So I look for authentic people, and there are easy ways you can find that in interviews. For example, if somebody says, I absolutely love coaching, and if it's a salesperson selling you, they'll probably have all the right answers for everything. You can ask them some basic questions like, so what sports do you play? Oh, I don't play any sports. I actually don't like sports. Clearly that's not an authentic situation. Somebody likes coaching, but they don't like sport. I mean, So there are lots of ways that you can get to the bottom of this, and I encourage you to really check for authenticity, particularly when you're interviewing salespeople. Not that I have anything against salespeople, I was one, but they're good, right? That's what they do for a living, so you've got to get to the bottom of it. So Matt, we haven't had you speak up on this, but you are in sales or in channel development. What would you look for when you were going to recruit a salesperson?
I think in the early stages of the company, Tom was looking for people that were startup oriented. So when I joined a couple of years ago, I was almost out of school. I'd started a web project of my own. It was very much sort of a part of the culture. I was a cultural fit. I think that's still something that we look for today is that mind, sort of that startup mindset. I think that's one of our key, key hiring points.
Well, thank you. I mean, one of the things you immediately did there was you gave away that you were already doing your own web project. I mean, how authentic is that? And you're joining a company that's building the next generation of platform for the web. It's obviously, that's authentic. That's a good example. The last A that I always look for, and it applies in pretty much any role, is an athlete. By which I mean somebody who has got the desire to perform in whatever it is they're doing. It doesn't mean to say they're literally physically an athlete, but they might be an athlete in the sense that they like to adapt and move on and compete. And in a startup, that's important. You're competing to win, and usually you're the smallest guy when you start out, and you've got to compete with bigger guys. So that's what it takes. So that's the 3 pluses and the 3 A's. And ultimately, this comes down to having 3 key things assessed, which is sort of the HR viewpoint of this. So this is, if you like, your last test of the thing, which is, can these people be successful at the job? And will they really love it? Those are the first 2 things. So if they can be successful at the job because you figured out they have the experience, knowledge, and skills and the smarts to do it, then the next thing is, will they really love it? In other words, is it going to be something that they can do and enjoy? And so I'll give you a question for that in a minute. But the last one is the one that we've been talking about all night, so I probably don't need to reinforce it, but I will. It's, will they fit? And that's back to that CQ thing. And I literally would say, if you only answered for yourself 3 things about every candidate. Let's say you've got 20 people doing an interview, which sometimes I see people do group interviews. Nothing wrong with that. But you're going to have to agree on what the priority is amongst you for whether you hire this person or not. Then these would be the 3 things I'd say. Ultimately, can you all say that this person can be successful, will love it, and will fit here? If the answer is yes to all of that, I guarantee you're on the right track with that hire. So it's a basic way in which to think about it. And the tools for doing this come down to what I call the golden triangle, which is ultimately, if you've said that you've checked the EQ, the IQ, and the CQ, and you've found people who've got the attitude, aptitude, and ability, then I'll guarantee you've found a golden hire. And that's why I define it as the golden triangle. It literally, when I look back at all the great hires I made, and I'm lucky enough to have 2 shiny examples here, I'm going to embarrass them for a second. So Steve, who spoke to you earlier, was the very first sales guy I hired. Actually, you were an internal sales guy. How old were you? 21 years old. I'm not going to embarrass him, but say how old he is, but it's a long time ago, decades. Is now a very successful CEO. John, you were a little older, but you weren't a lot older when I was lucky enough to recruit you. How old were you?
Oh, good question. Yeah, it's somewhat late 20s.
Another multi-time successful CEO. So we're lucky to have 2 examples here of what I would have described as golden hires. I was really lucky to work with these 2 guys. And the thing I'm most proud of in my career is not what I've gone on to do, it's what these guys have gone on to do. And they've been multi-time successful executives in very big public companies and gone on and started their own companies and built companies. If you do this right, you'll be able to stand up someday and say, I made a bunch of golden hires that did great things and went on to do amazing things in their own career to their own right. And it's not that difficult. So what are the tools? Let's bring this down to reality. Some of them are so obvious that they don't bear talking about, but I said this starts with listening. The first thing when you're doing EKS is ask few questions and listen 95% of the time. The biggest problem I see go wrong in interviews is people are selling. You can't sell before you listen. If you haven't figured out whether this person is a fit, but you've sold them on the company, how great was that interview? It's terrible, right? You haven't learned anything about the person. You've told them all about the company, but you don't know whether they're a fit here or not. In IQ, the thing I find people do is skip the proof. It's easy in engineering to give somebody a code test, so give them a code test. Just because they've done great things in the past doesn't mean to say that they're a fit for what you're doing. You may have a particular language that you're migrating them to, whether it's PHP and Drupal, or it's Ruby on Rails, or whatever it is. No big deal. Give them a test. People don't mind that. That's actually good, because guess what? You want to figure out whether this fit is right, so do they. They don't want to be hired in a place where you have wrong expectations of them. And then in this last one, which is the one we were talking about earlier, how do you figure out whether there's a cultural quality fit in the process? What's the tool there? Really simple. Trust the process. The process will tell you a lot about the person. How do they engage with you when they first get your call? How do they respond to you after you've been through the first interview? How do they take in your questions? Do they listen carefully, respond back openly? Do they care when you give them feedback or not? Do they take time to figure out who you are, to check out your company? Do they question you enough? Those things will tell you a ton about whether you've got somebody who's a cultural fit here. So these things, I think, are the basics of the tools that will help you find the right people. And then there's one last really important one, which is what I call real references. Because all of this needs validation. Because even if we're great interviewers, and I think, I've met some great interviewers in my time, unfortunately, we all need to figure out what's actually real behind all of this. And the references are things you need to do at 3 levels. You should ask people who they've worked with, so their peers. That's incredibly important. You should also ask people who've worked for them, if they've had people in a junior level, because that'll tell you a lot about how they deal with, for example, the organization. And then you should ask people, obviously, who they've worked for as well. What do they like to work with and to be managed? So those are basic things you should do. And because startups are different, I try to pull out some questions that I thought would really help you get started. And these are the top questions I always ask. And some of you have been interviewed by me in this room, so you can tell me whether this is true or not. For EKS, I always ask one key thing. And can anybody tell me what the most important word in that sentence is? Relevant. Yeah, relevant. You could talk all day long about what your skills and knowledges are, but what's important is what's relevant to this job. And if you ask somebody that question and they don't know the answer, you can tell right away they didn't do their homework, they weren't thinking about what job was involved or whether it's a fit for them. If they have, they'll be able to tell you. They'll be able to say, hey, look, I did this and I think it's directly relevant. So for example, it's really great that Matt came up and said he had relevant experience. He was doing a web project. What a great way to introduce that. On the IQ thing, what's the important word here? First line. There's lots of important words there, but anyone in particular stand out to you? Favorite. Who said favorite? Why is favorite important?
Because it tells you what the person is thinking about on their spare time.
Dead on. You want to know what they are excited about solving. Because guess what? When you're excited about solving something, you're going to put much more energy into it. So that key word to me is really important. And if people don't catch it when I'm asking them that question, that also tells me something. That means they're not that smart. They're not listening that well. So I ask that with great intent. And then what I'm really looking for, if I don't ask it explicitly, is how did you solve it? Obviously, there's lots of ways to solve a problem. But how you solve it tells me a lot about the way you approach things. And it's a great insight into your behavior. On the cultural thing, again, I don't need to ask this question now of what the most important words in here. But what I'm really looking for is, what have you most enjoyed in your previous jobs? Because if you find out what people have most enjoyed, and they start sharing that to you, it'll probably come out in lots of different ways. It won't necessarily just be about, for example, the problems they solved or the particular job they did, but it'll be how they are involved in it, what they liked about the environment. I hear all sorts of fantastic answers. Like sometimes I'll hear from somebody, for example, and this is an exact direct quote, which is, what I really loved at my last job was the ability to learn from these X people. And that's a really good thing for me to hear. It tells me that somebody's inquisitive, interested in learning and growing and so forth, and that's great. And then they'll tell me, by the way, what I did with it was X, Y, and Z. I learned from this and I grew that way. It's a great way of hearing it. And then what do you value most? Remember, we talked about values as a critical part of your culture. So this is a great way to find out, well, what do they value? Before you tell them anything about your company, what would they say they value most? And if they say integrity, passion, etc., guess what? You're probably checking off down the list of your cultural quality values or not, in which case you're going to find out whether you've got a fit or not. So these are my basics. They're all up on the website, so you don't have to write them down. But I'm sometimes struggling with time, as I will be here to wrap up on time. And so if I only have one question, literally only one question I can ask somebody, this is it. It works. Why? Because if people can really genuinely tell me what they're passionate about, and then it can explain what's behind it, I can learn so much about them. And I'll tell you, sometimes this is the only question I ask people in an interview because I can't find it out. Now that's a challenge for me, because oftentimes people haven't been asked this. They've never been given a chance to actually find out what they really care about. That's not to say they're a bad person. They just may not have been given that opportunity. I was lucky enough to be in China recently. We were trying to recruit to get somebody going for one of my larger companies. And I asked this question of this lady, and I won't say who it was, but she had never been asked that question. She was so regimented in how she'd been brought up. She was shocked. It took her a long time to answer the question, but when we finally figured it out, she turned out to be a fantastic, fantastic hire, because she was dying to prove that she could make an impact in the world, and she really got what our business was about. She just didn't know that it was possible to do that. So this stuff is really important, and I guarantee that if you try this question on people, is your opening question, it will change your perspective of them, and it'll give you a chance to find things out you never thought were possible. So time to summarize. Hopefully it's pretty obvious, but hire for CQ, that cultural quality of fit. Do the quality control. Do not just take it for granted. Check whether they're additive versus dilutive to the question we had from the back. Look for the 3 A's if you can get them. That's the pluses that on top of it that I also outlined. And if you get all of the above, you have got into that golden triangle. You will make a golden hire, as we've got real evidence of in here. So thank you for bearing on that section. And we're nearly at the end here. So I'm just going to let you know there are a couple of starting tips, practical startup hiring tips that I hear all the time. They're the most frequently asked questions, if you like, that I get. I'm not going to go through these, but they will be up on the site. And they are, for example, should I just hire people that I know? And there's a specific answer to that you'll find up on the web. The second is, should I hire youth or experience? And again, you'll find an answer to that up on the site. I'd like to just give Jamie one last chance here to talk about Acquia before we wrap up. Is there anything particularly you would want people to know about the way Acquia is hiring and how you do it and what you think are things that should stand out for them?
Well, that's a good question. So we are hiring like crazy, and we're in a huge growth spurt right now. And I think it's a culmination of what we've talked about today, which is that we are looking for the right cultural fit, we're looking for the right experience, we're looking for the whole package, and we are looking for that A-plus player. I think we've learned a lot, and a lot of the hiring managers have learned a lot in regards to that you never want to fall in love with a resume and ignore the cultural fit part, because 10 out of 10 times it will bite you, and it will be an expensive cost for you. So we are still very selective in the types of people that we hire into the organization, and we always want to make sure that, number one, first and foremost, they're a cultural fit to our organization.
This stuff really makes a difference. So from that same survey that we're talking about, these top 5 companies had 50% less turnover as a result of defining all the things we've been talking about: great culture, great vision, and hiring great people. And that is a huge impact, as we've talked about, on your company. If you can build a company which has 0 turnover as a startup for a period of time, it will make a big difference to your ability to get momentum and break out. And by contrast, I've seen the biggest potential ideas or breakthroughs fail because people didn't spend the time to create the culture that actually enables people to be successful around that idea or that breakthrough product. And people leave, you see starters fall out, and all sorts of startup people fall out and so forth. So I'll summarize by saying today, you've been very patient to listen to all of this, and I hope you've taken away that these are not rules and regulations or defined bases on which to do this. But if you do start with a clear understanding of the potential for your business and put that into a vision and mission that can absolutely entice people, inspire people, give them that basis to feel empowered, and you then define the culture that's going to enable them to go after that in a way that gives people the capability to go out there and absolutely drive their energy and deliver on their potential, then you can take your value proposition from where it is today as a small startup and build a big company. And there are many great examples, and I think we're well on our way to seeing one which we're lucky enough to have had here in Acquia. So thank you to the Acquia team, if you'd all be kind enough to give me a hand for joining us today. But before I wrap here, just want to say thank you to the iLab and make sure people know that we're happy to stick around and take questions. We'll do it either informally for the Acquia team that's going to be here, or if anybody has any last ones here, I'm happy to take any at the end here before we wrap up. A couple of minutes. Yeah, go ahead.
I might be getting a little ahead of myself, but I'm in HR and I have been for about 12 years here at Harvard. You spoke about the golden triangle and the philosophy on hiring.
Yep.
As your company gets a little bit bigger,
yep,
how do you impress that upon your hiring managers, as sometimes the hiring focus gets a little bit farther and farther away from HR, which may be doing primary hiring or screening interviews, and other people are actually doing more of the interviewing and hiring, and they may be more focused on the skill side versus the entire...
It's a great question, and I think it's generally applicable, so if you don't mind, Tom, I might ask you to give us a sort of a general answer to that.
It's hard as well when you're geographically dispersed, so it's a really tough one. Well, I do it by actually verifying the process of verifying as you do that. You obviously, initially in the process, I try to pull it in so that everyone understands those values early on. So as you grow and it gets more distributed, they've learned those values and that process and the things you need to know by the time it gets distributed, and they carry that with them. But even if you don't have that opportunity, and I've walked in to take over large organizations that were struggling and in a turnaround situation across Asia Pacific, and then I would go out and I would validate and verify I would do one-on-ones with some new hires after they've been hired, and if I found some inconsistencies, I would go back and speak with the hiring people at that point in time and say, hey, I'm seeing some things here that I don't like in the patterns. So that's how I've done it.
Did that answer your question? Great, thank you, Tom. Any other last ones before we wrap? Well, thank you guys all very much. Really appreciate you coming.